Hello.
Yes.
Yes. So I hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
Yeah. So good afternoon, respected professors and students who have gathered here for attending my presentation. So I'll be presenting on the topic how to balance environmental flows or ecological flows along with balancing water supply as well as hydropower. So the prime focus of this presentation would be on how to prioritize for ecological flows by satisfying other demands as well as hydropower requirements for the Nagarjuna Sagar Reservoir. So coming slide, I would like to emphasize on what essentially is environmental flows. So for a water body or a stream or a lake or a river, it's very important to maintain its natural hydrology so that you can sustain the aquatic ecosystem. So as far as the terrestrial animals are concerned or the aquatic organisms or the riparian ecosystem is concerned, it's very important to sustain the natural flows. So that is why it's very essential that along with satisfying the irrigation, urban and other requirements as well as the hydropower priorities, it's very important to prioritize for environmental flows. And when we look into the UN recent sustainable goals, which were from 2015, we can see that the sustainable goals 12, 13, 14 and 15 give a deep focus on environmental sustainable goals, where 14 and 15 emphasizes on maintaining a good aquatic ecosystem as well as maintaining a terrestrial ecosystem. So it's very important to prioritize for environmental flows. Now coming to my study, we focus on the Nagarjuna Sagar Reservoir, which is a reservoir in southern India, and it was one of the first reservoirs which was built after independence. And the primary purpose of the reservoir was to supply water downstream for irrigation as well as for satisfying urban needs as well as for generating hydropower too. So in the late 80s, 1980s, the turbine was constructed in the downstream and the water was released for hydropower. So in the right hand side, you can see the location of Nagarjuna Sagar Dam as well as the command and catchment areas also. So in the left hand side, you can see the catchment area, and in the right hand side you can see the command area, and the black triangle indicates the Nagarjuna Sagar Dam location. So the dam is located in the borders of Telangana as well as Andhra Pradesh states, and the purpose of dam is to supply water for hydropower in the pharmaceutical hub of India, Hyderabad, as well as satisfying the irrigation requirements in the Krishna basin, which includes regions of Andhra Pradesh as well as Telangana. And if you look more deeply into the land use land cover map, you can see that the larger proportion of the land is set suitable for cultivation, and you can see that the larger allocation of land is for agricultural practices. Now coming to this slide, in this slide I would like to explain about the decision problem for reservoir operation. So in the left hand side you can see a cartoon plot which describes the reservoir operation. So you can see that first the reservoir is updated with the inflows. So the inflows come into the reservoir, and then we have to satisfy a set of demands. So we have to satisfy the demand releases, which are predominantly irrigation requirements as well as urban requirements. And we also have to release for environmental flows to maintain the downstream aquatic ecosystem. And we also have to supply water for hydropower releases or generating hydropower. And the excess water is released as spills through the spillways. So there are a set of objectives involved here, and we have to prioritize for each and every objective. So for quantifying if there is sufficient water which is being released for demand releases or for other objectives, we use mathematical equations or matrices. So for quantifying if sufficient water or the objective function which is for satisfying the demand releases, we use the annual average deficit, which is an aggregate of the demand minus supply. For computing if sufficient water is released for environmental flows, we compute the environmental flow reliability. And for hydropower, as we all know, it's proportional to the hydropower generated is always proportional to the discharge as well as the head in the dam. And also we have another objective, that is flood reliability objective, which accounts for spills and which also accounts for safety of dam. It acts as a buffer during floods. So we have primarily 4 objectives. One is demand satisfaction. That is, for demand satisfaction, we have annual average deficit. We have MEF reliability, hydropower generation in gigawatt hour, as well as flood reliability. So the environmental flow thresholds which has to be satisfied has been taken with reference to Smatkin's paper of 2006, which suggests that the environmental flow should be equal to at least equal to 30% of average historical. Now coming to my methods figure, which you can see in the right side, we have the input set of information which we require. We have the model systems model block diagram, and we in the right hand side you can see how the results are interpreted. So the inputs into the systems model is the inflow. So inflow can be deterministic as well as stochastic. So we had stochasticized the inflow to quantify for inflow variability or uncertainty. And we have the demands which are inputted into the systems model, the flood threshold values as well as the MEF threshold values. And then in the systems model, we have a reservoir model which basically takes in the input values and it simulates the releases. And with the releases, we will be able to compute these objectives which I have mentioned before. And for computing these objectives or for running the systems model, we follow a multi-objective stochastic optimization, and the algorithm which we have used here is the Borg multi-objective evolutionary algorithm. And in formulating the systems model, we have 2 different formulations, which is of prior importance or focus in this presentation. So one formulation is in which we don't prioritize for MEF first. And the other formulation is one in which we prioritize MEF months first. So conventionally, reservoir operators prioritize for demands first and then they prioritize for hydropower. So in our formulation, in the second formulation that prioritizes for MEF, we try to release water first for MEF, and after satisfying the MEF requirement, we release water for satisfying demand requirements and hydropower. So after multi-objective optimization, we get a set of solutions or policies, and the policies result in different objectives also. So we get a trade-off of solutions, and these trade-off of solutions are Pareto dominated. So each of these solutions can perform better compared to other solutions, like either of the objectives compared to other solutions if the solutions aren't the Pareto front. And we identify the set of optimal solutions and we come up with strategies. Now, as I mentioned in the systems model, we have 2 types of formulation, the one that prioritizes MEF and one that prioritizes MEF and one that doesn't prioritize MEF. So first, the storage is updated with inflows, and then we release for demands in case of not prioritizing MEF, and then we supply water for hydropower, and finally we release the excess releases through spillways. So the amount of water that comes downstream for satisfying minimum environmental flows is the hydropower releases that comes from the turbine as well as the excess releases from the fields. But in the prioritizing case, where we prioritize for MEF, we release for MEF first, and then subsequently we release for demands, and we release for hydropowers, and finally we release for excess spills. So this environmental flows that was released initially, which is used to satisfy the aquatic environmental demands, is being added to hydropower releases and excess releases, and then we compute the MEF. And now we compare these MEF releases with the MEF thresholds, and we identify whether the MEFs are satisfied with our objective formulations. And now in this slide, I would go into a bit mathematical detail on how we decide upon the policies. So our policy here is the hydropower releases, and we condition the hydropower releases on the system storage. And for conditioning this, we use a mathematical formulation using a radial basis function. And this entire process of conditioning the releases or the policies upon the storage using mathematical radial basis function is called the direct policy search, which is essentially a policy search in which you search for policies across the decision space, and the policies are conditioned upon the reservoir storages. So mathematically, the policies of the hydropower is conditioned on the reservoir storage RT, and you have 2 parameters here, B and C, and the optimization algorithm or the multi-objective evolutionary algorithm optimizes for C and B, and it finds out the best set of policies here. So essentially what you get is a very flexible role curve or a very flexible policy curve, which is a function of storages. So our idea is to make the policies or releases more adaptive is essentially a daily model. So we try to make the policies more adaptive with respect to the reservoir storages. Now coming to the releases. So as I mentioned earlier, we are doing a multi-objective optimization, and we don't get a single solution, but we come up with a trade-off of solutions. So here I have added a parallel axis plot. So our primary question is, does prioritizing MEF over other demands, does it compromise with respect to other objectives? So in this parallel axis plot, we identify the trade-off or compromises between different objectives, and we have an axis, y-axis, which represents 4 different objectives. One is hydropower generated in gigawatt hour, the second one is average deficit, and then the flood reliability and MEF reliability. So here the green lines indicates the objective function values for the policies that prioritize MEF, and the red lines indicate objective function values for policies that doesn't prioritize MEF. So you can see that the opaqueness of line is different in 2 different contexts. So the lines which are lighter represent objectives or solutions which are being dominated by the green lines. So here you can look into the green lines which represent policies that prioritize MEF, and you can see that the policies perform really good in terms of MEF reliability with a value ranging from 80 to 99%. And in case of not prioritizing MEF, the values range from 60 to 90. Now our concern is, does it compromise other objectives? So you can see that there's a trade-off between hydropower and deficit in some of the cases, but I have selected 2 strategies or policies here which are represented using stars. So the green star is for the policy that prioritizes MEF, and the red is for that.
Your time is off.
Yes, so this is the last slide, second last slide. So, so I have selected 2 policies, and if you look very closely into the policies, you can see that the policy that prioritizes MEF performs substantially good in terms of MEF reliability, with lesser trade-off on flood reliability, but it performs good in terms of hydropower generated, but it performs a bit bad in terms of average deficit. So you will be able to generate policies by prioritizing MEF that is able to produce higher values of MEF reliability with lesser trade-offs or compromises on hydropower and flood reliability and average deficit. So coming to the final slide, as I mentioned before, we use flexible RPFs or dynamic policy search to come up with policies which are flexible in nature. So these are the 2 policies which are selected, which I have run for a deterministic case. And you can see the storage hydropower relationship for prioritizing MEF and non-prioritizing MEF. So in prioritizing MEF case, after a particular threshold, you release storages, for hydropower. And then this is the final plot. So here you can see the difference between the exceedance value, or for how much percentage of times for a daily time step model the MEF thresholds are being satisfied for a prioritizing MEF case as well as for a non-prioritizing MEF case. So it's very clearly evident that if you prioritize MEF, the MEFs are being satisfied in most of the cases. But one thing which we understood from this study is the MEFs are less satisfied in the early periods or the onsets of monsoons, which happens after the late summer. But if you prioritize for MEF, you will be able to satisfy MEF or satisfy the MEF objective with lesser compromises or without compromising other objectives. So that's all from my part. Thank you.
50% of average annual discharge. Then how will you get the estimate for at the monthly level or at the fortnight level?
Sir, it's 30% of the annual average discharge on a daily scale. So for each day, we compute the average across 30 years. So,
but in the monsoon kind of system will not be an erroneous because the average monthly discharge will always be less.
Yes.
Sorry. Average annual discharge will always be significantly less. If you have the peak here, then average annual will be a flat curve at a much below level. So it may not provide the right assessment of the e-flow.
Yes, sir. So in this study, our primary aim is to see whether if we prioritize for MEF, will we be compromising on other objectives. But the point you have said is very valid. So I'll look into it, and I'll try to set up the MEF thresholds accordingly. I'll look into the data and I'll try to make sufficient changes for accommodating
Okay, there is another question, and I think have you also compared the benefit obtained from MEF and without MEF?
Yes. So that is the idea in this work. So we have seen the trade-offs, like what essentially happens if we prioritize for MEF. So we have seen the trade-offs or how the other objectives are being compromised if we prioritize for MEFs. So we were able to find out that even if we prioritize for MEFs, we will be able to satisfy other objectives, at least compared to the historical case. So the historical case objectives that are satisfied is indicated using the black lines here. So we are able to satisfy all objectives simultaneously. Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Akshay. So,
thank you, sir. Thank
you. So now we will move to another presentation, and presentation by Rita Devi.